My name is Priya, and I am a 39-year-old. And here is my fucking story. Nani come from a small village in India, a place where dreams often wither before. They can bloom for the longest time I thought my life was destined to follow a predictable path. Marriage to Aman. My parents chose a life spent caring for children and a household that was never truly mine. But I wanted more. 2 years ago, I arrived in the United States, full of hope for a fresh start. I was ushered by the Harrison, a wealthy family, in Connecticut to take care of their 2 children, Emily and Jake. The job was perfect. Also, I thought Lisa, the mother, was kind and welcoming Daniel. Her husband seemed distant at first, but polite. The children quickly warmed to me, and I loved caring for them. But here I am, sitting alone in my small room, overwhelmed with guilt. I've been keeping a secret one so dark that it days just at me every single day. I'm having an affair with Daniel. As I write these words, my chest tightens with shame. Lisa trusts me completely. She's praised me countless times for the care I give her children, for the meals I prepare, for the way I've made their lives easier. And yet I've betrayed her in the worst way possible. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't come here looking for this. But Daniel has a way of making me feel seen, understood in a way no one ever has. And now I'm trapped in a web of passion and deceit, unable to free myself, yet consumed by the weight of my actions every day. I tell myself, it's time to stop too, walk away, but the thought of losing in him, even though I know he's not truly mine, is unbearable. This secret affair has become both my greatest escape and my deepest regret. How did it come to this? How did I, a simple girl from India, with dreams of a better life, end up here, hiding in the shadows of another woman home? To understand, you have to know how it all began. When I first arrived in the United States, everything felt overwhelming. The air was cold, sharper than anything I'd ever felt back home. And the streets seemed impossibly wide. I had never been away from my family before. And as I walked out of the airport into the chaos of taxis and hurried strangers, I felt a pang of doubt. What was I doing here, thousands of miles away from the only life I'd known? The Harrison were waiting for me when I arrived at their grand house in Connecticut. It was a sprawling home, with white columns, manicured lawns, and large windows that seemed to sparkle even in the weak winter sun. Lisa was the first to greet me, a tall, elegant woman in her late 30s. She hugged me warmly and said, "We're so happy you're here." Priya. Her words, though simple, made me feel seen in a way. I hadn't expected. Daniel appeared a moment later, carrying their youngest child, Emily. On his hip, he smiled, a brief but genuine expression, and extended his free hand. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and steady. The children, Emily and Jake, were charming from the start. Emily was 3 with curly blonde hair and a mischievous grin, while Jake at 6 was quieter, always clutching a book or some toy he wouldn't share. They seemed to take to me, immediately following me around as I unpacked and peppering me with questions about where I came from and whether I knew how to bake cookies. The first few weeks were a blur of adjusting to my new life. I spent my days caring for the children, preparing their meals, and keeping the house in order. Lisa was busy with her career and social commitments, often leaving early and coming back late. Daniel, on the other hand, worked from home more often than I'd expected. He had a home office on the 2nd floor. And though he kept to himself, I noticed his presence at first. I didn't think much of him. He was polite, but distant, always immersed in work, or distracted by his phone. He wasn't overly involved with the children, though he seemed to love them in his own way. I thought he was just another busy American father preoccupied with providing for his family. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to notice things. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the lingering glances we passed each other in the hallway, the way he would ask about my day, even when Lisa was around at first. I dismissed as harmless kindness. It wasn't until one evening, months after I'd settled into the job, that I started to feel a shift. I had just put the children to bed and was cleaning up the kitchen when Daniel walked in. He was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, his dark hair slightly tousled, as though he'd been running his hands through it. "You don't have to do all that he said. Justice during the dishes I was scrubbing, it's part of my job," I replied with a smile. Though my hands trembled slightly as I worked, he leaned against the counter, watching me for a moment. "Still," he said, "you do more than enough around here, Lisa, and I are lucky to have you." Something in his tone made me pause. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the polite attention of an employer. It was something else entirely. I finished the dishes quickly and excused myself, retreating to my room, but that night as I lay in, said I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way his voice had softened, the way his eyes had lingered on mine from that night on. Things began to change. Daniel seemed to find more excuses to be around. When I was alone, he would ask for my opinion on trivial matters, linger in the kitchen while I cooked, or offered to help with tasks that didn't require his involvement. And though I tried to ignore, the fluttering in my chest whenever he was near it became harder with each passing day. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was building between us, something that scared me as much as it excited me. The night everything changed, I had no idea what was coming. It was a quiet evening, the kind that usually lulled me into a sense of security. Lisa had gone out for a charity dinner, dressed in a sleek black gown, her hair swept up elegantly. Daniel stayed home, saying he needed to finish some work, and I was left to my usual room routine of putting the children to bed and tidying up. I remember humming softly to myself as I folded laundry in the living room. The house was still, the kind of peaceful quiet that often followed the children's bedtime chaos. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway. He wasn't in his usual button-down shirt and slacks, but a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messy. "You're still working?" Hasked, his voice softer than usual. "It's just long," I replied, smiling briefly. He stepped closer, sitting down on the armrest of the couch. "You know, you don't have to do it all, Priya. You already do so much for us." "I don't mind," I said, though his words made something flutter inside me. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just watched me fold the clothes, his expression unreadable. Then almost hesitantly he said, "You're incredible with the kids. They adore you." I felt a blush creeping up my cheeks and kept my focus on the clothes in my hands. "Thank you, they're wonderful children, and you." He continued, his voice dropping slightly. "You've made our lives so much better. I don't know how we managed. Before you came, there was something in the way he said it that made my heart race." I glanced up at him and our eyes met for a moment. Neither of us moved. There between us felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. "Danielle." I started, but before I could finish, he leaned forward and kissed me. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It was full of longing, of suppressed emotions, breaking free all at once. For a split second, I froze, my mind screaming at me to stop, to push him away. But then something inside me gave in. I kissed him, back, my hands trembling as they reached for him. The laundry slipped from my lap, forgotten, as Daniel pulled me closer. His hands were warm, steady as they rested on my waist. I could feel the strength in his arms, the way they held me like I was something precious. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. My heart was pounding and a wave of guilt crashed over me. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," he replied. But the way he looked at me told a different story that night. I lay awake in my bed, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. The next day, I avoided him as much as I could. I focused on my duties, keeping my interactions with him brief and professional. But every time our eyes met, I felt the same pull, the same undeniable connection. It wasn't long before we crossed the line again. This time, it was in the kitchen. I was chopping vegetables for dinner when he came up behind me, his presence sending a shiver down my spine. "Priya," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, and before I could say anything, he cued my face in his hands and kissed me. It was different. This time slower, deeper, as if he was savoring every moment. From that point on, there was no going back. Our affair began. In earnest fill with stolen moments and whispered secrets, we would meet in the early hours of the morning, when Lisa and the children were asleep, or during the brief times when the house was empty. Each time felt more dangerous than the last, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Daniel had a way of making me feel alive, of making me forget the loneliness I had carried with me for so long. But even in the midst of our passion, I couldn't escape the nagging guilt that followed me everywhere. As much as I tried to ignore at the weight of what we were doing was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. And yet I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Living a double life was both thrilling and exhausting. By day, I was the beautiful nanny playing with Emily and Jake, helping with their homework and making sure the household ran smoothly. By night, I became something else, entirely a woman caught in a whirlwind of forbidden passion. Daniel and I became experts at hiding our affair. We avoided eye contact when Lisa was around, kept our conversations brief and casual, and made sure our stolen moments were hidden behind locked doors, or during times we knew no one would disturb us. One afternoon, while Lisa was at her yoga class, Daniel and I found ourselves alone. In the house, I was organizing the children's toys in the playroom, when he walked in, shutting the door quietly behind him. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, but teasing. "I haven't," I replied quickly, though we both knew it wasn't true. He stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze making my heart race. "Priya, you don't have to feel guilty every time you look at me." I looked away, my hands fumbling with a stack of building blocks. "Lisa doesn't deserve this," I whispered. "And what about what I deserve?" He countered, his voice softer. "Now, I've been happier these past few months than I have in years. That's because of you." I didn't know how to respond to that. His words made my chest tightened with both guilt and longing. Before I could think of what to say, he ached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing my skin. "Priya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whisper. You're the best thing that's happened to me." In a long time, it was moments like these that made it impossible for me to walk away. When he looked at me like that, when he spoke to me in that quiet, heartfelt way, I felt like I was the only person in the world who mattered to him. But the reality of our situation was never far from my mind. Every time I saw Lisa laughing with her children, or thanking me for taking care of them, the guilt hit me like a wave. It started to question everything, my choices, my feelings, even my worth. How could I betray someone who had shown me nothing but kindness? And yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. Our secret moments grew more frequent and more daring. There were stolen kisses in the kitchen when the children were playing outside, whispered conversations late at night when everyone else was asleep, and even a few brief encounters in his car when Lisa was out running errands one night after the children were in bed. Daniel and E sat together in his office, the door locked to ensure no one would walk in. He poured us each a glass of wine, something he rarely did, and we sat in silence for a moment before he spoke. "Do you ever regret this?" he asked, his voice quiet. I hesitated, swirling the wine in my glass every day. I admitted, "But that doesn't mean I want it to end." He reached for my hand, his fingers threading through mine. "Neither do I," he said softly. The weight of his words stayed with me long after he left his office that night. As much as he wanted to believe that what we had was real, A part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The guilt was like a shadow, always lurking, always there. No matter how much. Daniel tried to reassure me. I couldn't silence the voice in my head that reminded me of the betrayal I was committing every single day. Lisa's kindness only made it worse. She often told me how much she appreciated me, how lucky they were to have me in their lives. Her trust in me was unwavering. In that trust felt like a knife, twisting deeper with every moment is spent with her husband. One afternoon, Lisa and I were sitting in the living room while the children napped. She was scrolling through her phone, sipping tea, and she suddenly looked up at me with a smile. "Priya," she said warmly, "you've been such a blessing to this family. I don't know how we managed before you came." Her words meant as a compliment. Hit me like blow. I forced a smile, humbling a thank you. But inside I felt like I was crumbling. How could I look her in the eye, knowing what I was doing behind her back that evening? I stayed in my room longer than usual, avoiding Daniel's usual attempts to draw me into conversation. I stared at the ceiling. Replaying Lisa's words in my mind, was it worth it? Was the passion and connection I felt with Daniel worth the betrayal of the woman who had treated me like family? I hope you will like my video. If you like the story, kindly subscribe my channel and press my bell icon for more video updates.